The sea was not kind in the north. It was a restless god, cold and endless, whispering its own creation stories in the language of crashing waves and hollow winds. On its surface, shards of light danced like the eyes of spirits, glinting between storms that never truly ceased. To live here, in the lands of ice and shadow, was to live in defiance. Yet from this defiance rose a people who would learn to tame the chaos, to carve destiny from frost and salt, the Vikings. Before the name carried terror across kingdoms, it was simply a rhythm, a breath drawn through the throat of the north. Vikinger, they called it, a word for the act of voyaging, of seeking, of venturing beyond. It meant far more than raiding. It meant movement, curiosity, and hunger. Hunger not merely for gold, but for horizons unseen. For the northern wind called not only to the warriors, but to dreamers, traders, poets, and those who believed that beyond the gray edge of the world, something waited. In the fjords of Norway, where mountains plunge into green water like the bones of the earth, young men would stand on rocky shores and watch the horizon. The sea mist kissed their faces, the scent of pine and iron filling their lungs. They felt the pull, the same pull that had tugged at their ancestors since the first oar struck water. Their mothers knew it too. The sea claimed sons as easily as the gods claimed souls. Yet still, they built ships. Still, they set sail. There was something elemental in it, something in their blood that refused stillness. Perhaps it was the land itself that forged them so. The soil was thin and stubborn, yielding only to those who fought it. Winters bit hard, nights lasted forever. The sun's light, when it came, was fragile and fleeting, a reminder that nothing beautiful lasts without struggle. To live was to endure, to shape the world through sheer will. And that will became the foundation of exploration. In the firelit halls of their longhouses, they told stories, not of kings or saints, but of adventurers who courted danger as a lover. Tales of men who had followed seabirds to islands unknown, of women who guided ships through fog so thick the sun disappeared. The sagas were not written yet, but they lived in memory, passed from mouth to mouth, word to word, until the idea of adventure became sacred. When the ice broke and the fjords began to breathe again in spring, the sound of axes echoed through the valleys. Great trees, pine, oak, ash, fell beneath the rhythm of their labor. The smell of sap mingled with sea brine as craftsmen shaped the keels that would become their legacy. A Viking ship was more than wood. It was a living thing. The curve of its hull was as graceful as the spine of a whale, its planks sealed with tar and animal fat, its prow carved into dragons and serpents that guarded against spirits of the deep. When the first ship slipped into the water, the crowd would cheer not as for a tool, but as for a child born into the world. Every voyage began with sacrifice. A few drops of ale poured into the waves, a whispered prayer to Njord, god of the sea, or to Odin, lord of wisdom and death. And when the sail unfurled, that bold square of red or striped linen, the wind would catch it like destiny itself, pulling them toward a horizon that few had dared to chase. They were not blind wanderers. The Vikings were masters of navigation, reading the sun through crystals of calcite called sunstones, finding direction through cloud and fog. They mapped the world not on parchment, but in memory, in the rhythm of waves, the cries of gulls, the color of the water beneath their ships. The ocean spoke to them, and they listened. At first, they followed the coasts, to the British Isles, to the lands of the Franks, to the rivers that led deep into Europe's heart. But soon their courage grew teeth. They crossed open seas to the Faroe Islands, Iceland, Greenland, even to the edge of a world that would one day be called America. To them, exploration was both a necessity and an art, a way to live beyond limits. And in every voyage was a paradox, the search for new lands born not from peace, but from hardship. Norway's mountains offered little soil for farming. Sweden's forests and lakes, though rich in beauty, were poor in opportunity. Denmark, though gentler, could not hold all who hungered for more. The sea became their release valve, their road to freedom. But there was also something deeper, an unspoken belief that to move outward was to move closer to the divine. The Norse gods did not reward stillness. Odin himself was a wanderer, sacrificing an eye for wisdom, hanging from the world tree for 9 nights to learn the secrets of life and death. Thor rode into storms, not away from them. Freyja wept for her lost husband, whose travels took him beyond the edges of the world. To explore was to imitate the gods, to honor them through action. When we think of the Vikings, we imagine horned helmets and burning villages, the myths of later ages. But their true legacy lies not in destruction, but in expansion, the expansion of mind and map alike. They saw the world as something to engage with, to learn from, to master. Their settlements in Iceland gave rise to the oldest surviving parliament in the world. Their explorations connected continents long before others dared to dream it possible. And so, the saga begins not with conquest, but with curiosity, with the question that echoed across every shore they left behind. What lies beyond? That question, simple, human, eternal, would define an age. It would send men and women into the unknown with hearts that beat in rhythm with the sea. It would shape legends, kingdoms, and the course of history itself. The north wind rises again, whispering over the waves, carrying with it the echo of oars and the promise of discovery. The story of the Vikings does not begin in war. It begins in wonder. Before the ships and the sagas, before the roar of battle and the glitter of treasure, there was the land, the cold crucible that shaped the soul of the North. To understand the Vikings, one must first understand the world they called home. Scandinavia was a place of contradiction, beauty and brutality, abundance and scarcity, creation and decay in eternal struggle. In Norway, mountains pierced the clouds like ancient spears, their peaks dusted in snow even when summer dared to bloom below. Valleys carved by glaciers carried rivers of ice-fed water, clear and sharp as glass. In Sweden, dark forests stretched endlessly, their silence broken only by the crack of branches and the low whisper of wind through pine needles. And Denmark, flatter, gentler, yet surrounded by restless seas, was a crossroads of Europe and the North, a place where cultures mingled and ships came and went like migrating birds. But for all its splendor, this world was not kind. The winters were long and merciless. The sun, when it returned, did so shyly, as though afraid of its own light. Frost crept into the bones of the people, reminding them that life was something to be fought for daily. The earth gave little freely. Grain was precious. Cattle were wealth. Hunger was a memory that lingered even in times of plenty, a shadow on every table. From this hardship was born resilience, a kind of fierce intimacy with the natural world. The Norse did not see nature as something to conquer, but as something to negotiate with. Every storm, every harvest, every birth and death was part of an ongoing conversation with forces far greater than themselves. The sea could take a man's life as easily as grant him fortune. A mountain could hide treasure beneath its roots, or swallow a traveler in snow. The world was alive, filled with spirits and gods, each demanding respect. Their mythology was not fantasy. It was a reflection of their landscape. In the roar of thunder, they heard Thor's hammer. In the dance of the northern lights, they saw the armor of the Valkyries shining across the sky. The sagas were maps of meaning, a way to understand a world that gave no easy answers. To be Norse was to walk daily among gods and giants, between life and death, between known and unknown. Children learned early that everything had a price. To build a home meant braving the wilderness. To sail meant risking the sea's hunger. Yet they also learned to see beauty in these dangers. The fjord's stillness at dawn, when mist clung to the water like silk. The scent of pine smoke rising from longhouse fires. The laughter of kin as mead flowed beneath the sound of rain on thatched roofs. Life was fragile, and therefore precious. Their homes, long and narrow, stood like wooden beasts against the elements. Inside, warmth came not just from fire, but from community. Families gathered close, telling stories that turned the harshness of their world into something sacred. These stories became the veins of their culture, flowing with lessons, pride, and identity. They taught courage through myth, patience through winter, unity through struggle. But the same world that fostered kinship also sowed restlessness. The fjords, though beautiful, were cages of stone. The forests, deep and endless, could feel suffocating. The Vikings were surrounded by boundaries, physical and otherwise, and in their hearts grew the desire to break them. The horizon became a promise. Somewhere out there, beyond the gray waves, was space to breathe, to grow, to live. As centuries passed, that longing became destiny. Communities expanded, populations grew, and resources thinned. Young warriors and farmers found themselves yearning for something their homeland could no longer give. Opportunity, wealth, freedom, these lay not in the frozen soil of home, but across the sea. The call of exploration was not just romantic impulse. It was survival. Yet even as they prepared to leave, they carried their world within them. Its beliefs, its traditions, its fierce love of kin and land. In every wooden ship that set sail, the North itself sailed too, its storms, its light, its myths. When Viking settlers reached Iceland, they named its landscapes with the same reverence they gave their own. Mountains became gods, valleys held stories, rivers whispered omens. To them, the world was one great living being, and travel was a conversation between its many faces. The gods of the Norse pantheon reflected this relationship with nature. Odin, the wanderer, sought knowledge even in darkness, a mirror of the Viking thirst for discovery. Thor, protector of mankind, embodied strength against chaos, the eternal struggle of man versus storm. Freyr and Freya governed fertility and beauty, gentle reminders that even in the North's harshness there was grace. Loki, the trickster, symbolized the unpredictable, the frost that came too early, the wave that broke the keel, the twist of fate that could turn triumph into tragedy. Their rituals, too, were born from the land. Sacrifices were made not from cruelty, but from understanding that life and death fed one another, that balance was everything. They offered blood to the earth for harvest, silver to the sea for safe passage, song to the sky for mercy. Every gesture was an echo of gratitude and fear, two emotions that shaped their entire existence. And so, when they began to sail, it was not rebellion against their home, but continuation of it. The sea was merely another kind of mountain to climb, another kind of god to honor. The same discipline that taught them to endure winter taught them to endure the ocean's fury. The same hunger that pushed them through famine drove them across horizons. Fire and frost, these were their teachers. Between them, the Vikings learned the art of balance, to be fierce but patient, daring yet disciplined, wild yet wise. Their greatness as explorers did not come from luck or chance, but from centuries of living in conversation with a world that demanded everything and gave little. The land carved their bodies, the sea sculpted their souls, and when at last they set their oars to water and raised their sails to the wind, they carried within them the memory of the North, a memory that would shape empires, birth legends, and whisper through time long after their ships turned to dust.
It was the ship that made the Viking, not the sword, not the axe, not the shield. The longship was more than timber and sail. It was freedom shaped into form, destiny carved from the heart of a tree. When it glided across the waves, narrow and sleek, it seemed to defy the very laws of nature. It could slice through storm-tossed seas and creep silently into shallow rivers. It was both weapon and womb, carrying men to glory and sometimes to their graves. The heart of every voyage began in the forest. There, under the whispering canopy of birch and pine, shipwrights searched for the right trees, old, tall, patient, legit. Each tree was chosen not just for its size, but for its spirit. Two fell. One was to awaken something ancient. The first cut of the axe was an act of reverence, a conversation between man and wood. In the Norse tongue, trees were kin-living beings, part of Yggdrasil, the great world tree that connected all realms. And so, each ship was born as a child of that cosmic tree, destined to carry the souls of men between worlds. Here, in the shipyards that lined the fjords, sawdust mingled with the salt wind. Hammers rang against iron nails, echoing across the valleys like distant thunder. The air smelled of tar and smoke, of sweat and pine resin. The craftsmen worked without blueprints. Their knowledge flowed through muscle memory, passed down from father to son, master to apprentice. They knew how to curve the planks just so to let the wood's grain decide the shape of the hull. They bent the boards with heat and patience, coaxing them into the curves that made the longship glide as if alive. Every part of the vessel was built with purpose. The keel, the backbone, was hewn from the straightest oak, a single unbroken piece. Veers spread from it like wings, giving the ship its strength and grace. Planks overlapped in the style they called clinker-built, each layer fastened with iron rivets, each seam sealed with wool soaked in pitch. The result was a body both light and strong, flexible enough to survive the wrath of northern seas. The sail, square and proud, was their greatest triumph, woven from wool and dyed with red ochre or bark. It was a symbol of life's fire against the grey of the ocean. When the wind filled it, the sound was like breath itself, a living, beating sound that stirred the blood. The oars, long and slender, waited along the sides like sleeping limbs. When storms came, or winds died, it was these oars that kept the ship alive. Pulling it forward stroke by stroke, heartbeat by heartbeat, and at the prow, the face of the ship stood the dragon. Carved with teeth bared and eyes wide, it was meant to strike fear into spirits and men alike. Yet, the dragon was not only a monster, it was a guardian. It carried the fire of home, the fury of the gods, the strength of the ancestors. Some say the figureheads were removed before returning to shore, so as not to frighten the land spirits of their homeland. Even in their craftsmanship, the Vikings walked the line between reverence and defiance. When a ship was finally complete, it was christened with ceremony. The people gathered at the water's edge, families, warriors, children clinging to their mothers' cloaks. A cup of ale was lifted to the gods. A libation poured into the sea. Some say a drop of blood from an animal, or from the builder himself, was mixed with the tar, binding the ship to its human makers. Then came the moment of release. The longship, greased with tallow and guided by ropes, slid down its wooden ramp and into the waiting sea. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the water embraced it, and the crowd erupted, shouting names, blessings, promises. From that moment, the ship had a soul. Each vessel was unique, with its own temperament and fate. Some were swift and eager, slicing through waves as if racing time itself. Others were stubborn, creaking like old warriors reluctant to fight again. To the Vikings, this was no superstition. It was understanding. The sea was alive, and so their ships must be alive too. Only a living thing could hope to survive the ocean's moods. Aboard these ships, community was everything. Each man had his place: rowers, helmsman, steersman, lookout. The leader, often a jarl or seasoned warrior, commanded not with fear, but with trust. On long voyages, they sang to keep rhythm, the songs deep and steady, rising and falling with the oars. The sound of their voices echoed over the waves, a haunting blend of exhaustion and exultation. Vive. It was in these moments that the bonds of brotherhood were forged, stronger than iron, stronger than blood. At night, they anchored near shore, their ships rocking gently under the northern stars. Fires burned low in iron braziers, the smell of fish and smoke drifting across the water. They spoke of home, of wives and children, of harvests and mead, of the gods who watched over them. The sea was vast, but their hearts remained anchored to the land that made them. And yet, the longship gave them something the land never could: the feeling of limitlessness. To stand at its prow, the cold spray stinging your face, was to feel infinite, to believe, if only for a moment, that nothing was beyond reach. These ships carried not just warriors and traders, but dreamers. They were the wings of the north, cutting paths across the unknown. Archaeologists would one day find them buried beneath the soil in graves fit for kings and queens, their hulls filled with treasure, weapons, even sacrificed horses. For the Vikings believed that just as a ship carried a man across the sea, so too could it carry his spirit into the next world. Or, in their minds, the boundary between life and voyage was thin as the line where water meets sky. It is easy now, from the safety of our modern world, to see the longship as relic or myth. But in its time, it was revolution, a marvel of engineering that changed history. It united coasts, conquered distances, and carried the Norse spirit farther than any empire had imagined possible. From these decks, men saw lands they had only dreamed of and claimed them. From these hulls, cultures met and clashed and intertwined. The longship was more than transport. It was transformation. And through it, the Vikings learned what all great explorers must: that to cross the sea is not just to move through space, but to move through self, to become something new with every wave that breaks.
The first time the Vikings pushed beyond the sight of their own shores, the world must have seemed to tilt. The mountains and forests of home shrank into mist behind them, swallowed by a horizon that felt infinite. The sea grew wilder, the sky broader, the air colder. Every sound, the creak of wood, the slap of water against the hull, the beat of the oars, was amplified by the vast emptiness around them. In that moment, they were alone with the gods and with themselves. No one knows exactly who first led the ships into the unknown. The sagas name many: Ragnar, Rolf, Leif, Erikman, whose deeds were half history, half dream. But long before fame etched their names into stone, there must have been a first voyage that had no audience, no saga, no glory, only the raw pulse of curiosity and courage. They would have followed the coasts at first, the edge of Norway curving south toward Denmark, then across the narrow throat of water that separated them from the land of the Angles and Saxons. The wind would have carried the scent of foreign earth, strange and rich, and on the far shore smoke rose from unknown hearths. These were not yet the great raids that would burn through Europe's memory. These were cautious journeys, scouting, trading, testing. When they first came ashore in England, the land must have seemed a mirror of their own rolling hills and green fields, rivers like silver threads cutting through the soil. But there was something different too: softness. The villages were unfortified, the people unarmed, their gods silent and invisible. To men raised in a world where the divine shouted from thunder and storm, this gentleness must have seemed both strange and vulnerable. And so, curiosity turned to opportunity. The first recorded Viking raid came in the summer of 793 upon the holy island of Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumbria. It was a small place, a monastery built on stone and faith, where monks lived quiet lives of prayer. The morning had dawned calm, the sea smooth as glass. Then came the longships sliding out of the mist, their sails red as blood, their dragon heads glaring. To the monks, it must have looked as though the demons of Revelation had risen from the deep. What happened next would echo for centuries. The Vikings stormed the island, their axes flashing, their cries mingling with the clash of bells. The monastery was stripped bare gold chalices, silver crosses, jeweled manuscripts, all taken. But it was not just wealth they carried away. They carried fear, and with it, reputation. Word spread across Christendom that a new kind of terror had come from the north, a people without pity, who laughed at the crosses of priests and worshipped strange, violent gods. Yet behind that terror was something more complex. The Vikings did not see the raid as sacrilege. To them, it was conquest and act of strength, proof of worth. Their gods demanded courage and reward. The monks, in their silence, might have seemed almost dead already. The Norse did not understand a faith that called for humility before a God who never answered. In their own world, power was proof of divine favor. The success of Lindisfarne lit a fire across the north. More ships followed, more men, more ambition. What had begun as exploration became expansion. They struck England again and again, Jarrow, Iona, Dublin, York. Each time, they learned more, the shape of the coasts, the weaknesses of walls, the trade of fear for silver. They were no longer merely explorers. They were a storm with purpose. But to call them only raiders is to miss the greater truth. Many who set sail did not come to destroy, they came to live. After the raids came settlement. They brought families, livestock, tools. They built homes in Ireland and Scotland, in the Shetlands and the Orkneys. They founded cities, Dublin, Limerick, Waterford, places that still breathe their names. They blended with local peoples, trading words, customs, and blood. Their ships carried not just warriors, but craftsmen, poets, and farmers. In foreign soil, they planted the seeds of new worlds. The sagas speak of men who stayed behind, who fell in love with new lands and never returned. For them, the sea was not escape, but transformation. Still, every voyage carried danger. Storms could rise without warning, turning calm seas into mountains of gray rage. Ships splintered, men vanished, prayers to Odin went unanswered. The ocean did not care for courage. The dead were given to the waves, their bodies sinking into the cold silence beneath. Yet even then, the survivors pressed on, driven by something greater than fear. They began to push farther west to the islands, east to the rivers of Europe. Down the Seine they rode, their ships cutting through France like blades. They reached Paris itself, besieging the city until its king paid ransom to make them leave. In the east, they followed the great rivers of Russia, the Dwina, the Volga, the Dnieper, founding trade routes that would link Scandinavia to Byzantium. There, under the blazing domes of Constantinople, they traded furs, amber, slaves, and swords for silks, spices, and silver. The Norsemen called it Miklagard, the great city. In the south, they learned diplomacy and coin. In the west, conquest and colonization. Everywhere they went, they adapted. It was this fluidity, this ability to learn and absorb, that made them more than mere marauders. They were shapeshifters of history, able to be both destroyers and builders, invaders and settlers, pirates and merchants. At home, tales of these voyages spread like wildfire. Children listened wide-eyed as old men recited sagas of distant lands where the sun burned hotter and the gold shone brighter. The longhouse fires crackled, casting shadows that danced like waves across the walls. The young listened not with fear, but with longing. The sea had become a promise, and every horizon another heartbeat calling them forward. Their journeys were not aimless. Beneath the blood and salt, there was purpose. To seek fortune, yes, but also to test themselves against the world. Every storm survived, every coast conquered, every trade made was proof that they belonged to something larger, a people who refused stillness. To move was to live. To stop was to die. And so the Vikings became both myth and reality, their sails a symbol of both terror and awe, their oars beating like the drums of fate. They had begun to redraw the map of the known world, and they were not finished. For beyond the western sea, whispers began to rise, of lands unclaimed, of islands hidden in fog, of a horizon that never ended. The long ships turned westward again, toward the unknown. The age of exploration was only beginning.
At the ocean, beyond the familiar coasts, was a living creature, vast, mercurial, unknowable. It breathed in tides and spoke in thunder. To the Vikings, this was not an obstacle, but an invitation. The horizon, forever shifting, shimmered like a promise. And though no map could tell them what lay beyond, the sea itself whispered directions to those who could listen. They called it the Whale Road. Through the open sea that curved west from the Scandinavian heartlands into mystery. To most of Europe, this was the edge of the world, a place where the ocean fell into darkness, where serpents waited and gods kept watch. But to the Vikings, the unknown was never something to fear. It was something to master. Their ships, built for the task, became arrows loosed from the bow of destiny. With oars as their heartbeat and sails as their lungs, they cut across the North Atlantic like spirits of the storm. The wind was sharp with salt and ice, the air tasting of iron, their beards crusted with frost. Their hands blistered from rowing, yet their eyes were fixed forward, always forward. Their first destinations were the stepping stones of the sea, the Shetlands, the Orkneys, the Faroes' lonely outposts where seabirds screamed and cliffs plunged like knives into the foam. These islands became way stations, outposts of the Norse world. Here they built small settlements, half refuge, half launch point. The sagas say the gods guided them, but it was skill, instinct, and the courage to read the moods of wind and wave that carried them safely through. From these islands, they looked farther still. In the distance, beyond the grey haze, they sensed land, a place whispered in the stories of sailors and seen in the flight of birds. And so they sailed west again, through fog thick as wool, through storms that howled like wolves. Days passed without sight of sun or shore. Men whispered prayers to Nejad and Agia, gods of sea and storm. The ship creaked under the weight of the ocean's rage, its timbers groaning like the bones of giants. 2. Then, one morning, the fog lifted, and there it was, a coastline rising from the mist like a vision. Black cliffs, green meadows, mountains crowned with ice. Iceland. To the weary sailors, it must have seemed like the edge of creation itself, raw, untouched, waiting. Streams sparkled through valleys of moss and stone. Geysers hissed from the earth like the breath of dragons. The land was harsh but alive, full of power. The Norse saw it not as wilderness, but as opportunity. Here was space. Here was freedom. They came first to fish, to hunt, to rest, but soon they stayed. 2. In the late 9th century, settlers began to arrive in waves, fleeing the tightening grip of kings back home. In Norway, Harald Fairhair had begun to unify the land under his rule, demanding allegiance from all clans. Many proud families refused to bow. Rather than live as subjects, they chose exile. The sea, as always, offered escape. In Iceland, they found a new beginning. They cleared land, built homes of turf and timber, planted grain, and raised livestock. The land was unforgiving, yet fertile in spirit. And there, on that volcanic island between fire and ice, they built something extraordinary, a society without kings. The Althing, founded around 930, was the world's first national assembly, a gathering where free men met each summer in a valley called Thingvellir to speak, argue, and decide the laws of their new world. There were no thrones, no crowns, only words. Disputes were settled by consensus, justice balanced between honor and pragmatism. It was democracy born from necessity, and it would outlast empires. The Icelandic sagas, written centuries later, would remember these people not just as warriors, but as storytellers, men and women who turned memory into myth. They recorded the courage, the feuds, the loves and betrayals that had shaped their lives. Through those tales, the heartbeat of the Viking world would echo long after the sails had faded from the sea. But even as Iceland thrived, the horizon continued to whisper. Beyond it lay something more, another island, larger, colder, harder. Stories reached them from fishermen who had drifted too far west, of a land where ice met ocean and sunlight lingered in strange ways. The explorers followed the signs, the flight of seabirds, the drift of seaweed, the taste of salt in the wind until one day they found it. Greenland. The name was almost a joke. A word of hope or deception, Eric read. The exile who led them there called it Greenland to lure settlers to its frozen shores. But though its coasts were harsh, its fjords could sustain life. They built farms and churches, raised cattle, and carved a fragile existence from the rock. Their houses faced south, toward the warmth of the sun that rarely came. Their hearts faced west, toward the unknown that still called. It was from Greenland that another legend would rise, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, a man whose curiosity would carry him farther than any Norseman before him. Guided by rumors of land glimpsed by earlier sailors, Leif set his sails into the western wind. The sea that awaited him was endless and strange. Icebergs glimmered like ghosts in the distance. Veils breached beside the ship, their dark bodies gliding through the waves like living shadows. Weeks passed. Food dwindled. The crew's faith wavered. But one dawn, when the sky burned red with northern light, a cry went up from the bowland. They came to a place where the forests grew thick and the air smelled of sweet sap. Grapes hung wild along the shores, a miracle to men from the north. They called it Vinland, the land of wine. It was not paradise, but it was promise proof that the world was larger than anyone had dreamed. Leif Erikson and his crew built houses and stayed through the winter. Trading with the native peoples, they met cautious exchanges, tense but respectful. They did not stay forever. Distance was too great, the ties to home too thin. But they had crossed the Atlantic 5 centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of it. The Vikings had reached the edge of the world and touched it. Yet even as they discovered new lands, something in them began to shift. The spirit of exploration, once born from hunger and freedom, began to strain against the changing tides of history. The same winds that had carried them outward would soon turn against them. But for now, in the golden age of their wanderings, the seas still called, and the ships still answered. The horizon was infinite, and the world had not yet told them no.
For 2 centuries, the Norse world had thrived on motion, on the rhythm of oars and the promise of the next horizon. But no wave crests forever. Every age of conquest becomes an age of reckoning. The wind that had once carried their longships now began to shift, cold and uncertain. In the east, the rivers of Russia grew dangerous, the markets of Byzantium less welcoming. In the west, the kingdoms they had plundered were learning to defend themselves. England, once an easy prize, now struck back with iron teeth. Alfred of Wessex and his descendants built fleets to match the Norse, fortresses of stone instead of wood, and armies that stood their ground. The Saxons had learned from their tormentors. When King Canute, a Dane, rose to power in the early 11th century, it seemed the Vikings had conquered not just England, but fate itself. His empire stretched from Norway to Denmark to Britain, the North Sea his private highway. Under his rule, the Viking dream reached its zenith, an empire built by the sea, unified by strength. But even empires built on waves must eventually break against the shore. Canute's sons quarreled after his death. His empire fractured. England slipped from Norse control, and Denmark turned inward. The unity of the North dissolved into rivalry once again. And in the quiet between wars, something unexpected took root. Faith. The old gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, still ruled the sagas, but their temples stood beside new crosses. Christianity had come north, first on the lips of missionaries, then on the orders of kings. It crept through the fjords and valleys, whispered from pulpits, promised eternal life in exchange for the old ways. At first, the Vikings resisted. The gods of their ancestors were carved into their ships, sung into their stories, tattooed into their flesh. But conversion was not a battle of swords. It was a war of patience. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway returned from exile in the 990s with a new weapon, faith. He baptized with one hand and burned temples with the other. Villages that refused to kneel found themselves on fire. The White Christ, as they called him, was a god of power, and power spoke loudly. Soon, the cross replaced the hammer on shields. Churches rose where once there had been altars of stone. The Vikings had not been defeated by arms, but transformed by time. The change was not total, nor immediate. For generations, the old beliefs lingered, the gods fading like echoes in the mountains. A man might pray to Christ on Sunday and still leave offerings to Thor before setting sail on Monday. But the world was shifting beneath their feet. As faith changed, so did trade. The raids slowed, replaced by markets and marriages. The long ships that once carried warriors now carried goods, silk, silver, spices. The Norsemen became merchants and settlers, not marauders. Their children grew up speaking new tongues, wearing foreign fashions, building towns instead of burning them. In Iceland, the Althing debated which god should rule. In 1000 CE, after long argument, they chose Christianity, not through war, but through words. It was a decision made to keep peace, to hold a fragile unity. Yet even as the cross was raised, the old sagas were written down, not as rebellion, but remembrance. The Icelanders became the keepers of memory, ensuring that the stories of Odin and Thor would not vanish with the smoke of their temples. Elsewhere, the tide was less gentle. In Norway and Denmark, the kings saw Christianity as a tool of order, a means to unify tribes under divine authority. In Sweden, conversion came slowly, resisted in the forests and the north. But one by one, the old sanctuaries fell silent. The Viking world had always been defined by duality, chaos and creation, war and wonder, sea and sky. Now another duality emerged, faith and reason, past and future. The people who had once worshipped many gods now served one, but they never forgot the others. In the carvings of their churches, dragons and serpents still coiled. In their songs, the names of Odin and Thor were whispered between verses of Latin prayer. The transformation of faith mirrored the transformation of power. The age of raiders had become the age of kings. Monarchs sought legitimacy through the church, not the sword. The warrior's axe gave way to the crown and the cross. But something was lost in the trade. The old wildness, that restless hunger for discovery, began to fade. Where once men sailed to the ends of the earth, they now built walls, towns, laws. Civilization grew from the bones of freedom. Still, the spirit of the Vikings did not die. It changed shape. It became memory, myth, culture. The Norse words for wind and storm, for honor and home, lingered in the languages of the lands they touched. Their descendants carried their blood and their stories, even if they no longer carried axes. In Greenland, the Norse colonies clung to life for centuries, their farms shrinking as the climate cooled. The sea ice grew thicker. Trade with Europe waned. Their churches stood silent under drifting snow. By the 1400s, they were gone, vanished into the white, leaving only ruins and bones. Some say they perished. Others whisper they sailed west again, following the ghost of Leif Erikson toward the horizon, toward Vinland, toward the unknown. It is fitting, perhaps, that their final fate remains a mystery. The Vikings began as wanderers, and they ended as whispers on the wind. Their stories outlived their kingdoms. Their gods became legends, their voyages became myth, their names became echoes in the stones of Europe. The tide had turned, but its retreat left behind something indelible, a memory carved into the bedrock of the North, that the world belongs not to those who wait, but to those who dare. And though the long ships rest now beneath centuries of silt, and the whale road has gone silent, the horizon still gleams, the same horizon they once chased. For in every age, there are those who look out at the edge of the world and feel the old hunger stir again. The age of the Vikings had ended, but the echo of their oars never truly ceased. Across Europe, traces of their presence lingered like salt on the wind, a whisper of the old gods beneath the songs of new churches. They had changed the world, though the world did not yet realize how deeply. In the British Isles, the Norse had sown both blood and culture. Cities like York, once Jorvik, bore their imprint in stone and street. Beneath cobblestones lay layers of their world, wooden halls, runic carvings, the remains of traders and warriors who once called the place home. The language itself had absorbed them. Everyday English, words like sky, egg, knife, window, husband, carries the echo of Old Norse. 1,000 years later, we still speak their legacy without knowing it. Even the laws bore their mark. The Danelaw, once a Viking-controlled territory in England, had set patterns of governance that would ripple through history. Local assemblies or things became models of collective judgment, a reminder that even among raiders, there was a deep respect for order, for consensus, for the weight of the spoken word. In Normandy, the Vikings had become the very thing they once despised: lords, nobles, landowners. The descendants of Rollo, the Viking who had once taken the land by force, grew into the Norman dukes who would one day invade England under a new banner. When William the Conqueror crossed the Channel in 1066, it was not the return of the Vikings, but their evolution. His men spoke French, wore mail, rode horses, yet their blood remembered the sea. The conquest of England by the Normans was, in truth, the final Viking invasion in disguise. But beyond the wars and borders, something more subtle endured, a way of seeing the world. The Vikings had believed that life was a voyage. That fate was a thread spun by unseen hands, that death itself was not an end, but another shore. This worldview, fierce, fatalistic, but strangely free, seeped into the European imagination. The sagas, written centuries after the last long ship sailed, captured it in haunting prose. The dignity of courage, the melancholy of impermanence, the beauty of striving against doom. To read the sagas is to glimpse the soul of a people who never stood still. They are not mere stories of gods and heroes. They are maps of a worldview, drawn in wind and water and blood. In those stories, we meet men and women who live in the shadow of vastness, farmers who defy kings, seers who speak with the dead, warriors who face the end of the world with laughter. Their gods, too, are mortal, destined to die in Ragnarok, the twilight of the world. There is a strange nobility in that. Even the divine is not eternal. The Norse saw no shame in dying, only in living without honor. That ethos shaped how they explored. For them, the unknown was not to be feared, it was to be tested. The sea was a mirror for the soul, calm one day, merciless the next. To survive, it was to earn one's place in the story of the world. Even as their ships disappeared from the horizon, their descendants carried that spirit forward. In Iceland, poets and historians became the new explorers, mapping not lands but language. Men like Snorri Sturluson preserved the myths and histories of the North. weaving prose that would one day inspire the imaginations of writers from Tolkien to Boris. The sagas became the longships of memory, carrying the old world into the new. Through them, the Vikings sailed again, across centuries and cultures. And yet, their legacy was not only one of words. It was carved into bones, into art, into the very tools of civilization. Their shipbuilding techniques influenced generations of mariners. Their designs, clinker-built hulls, overlapping planks, set the foundation for European naval architecture. Their navigational instincts, guided by the sun and stars and seabirds, would one day echo in the voyages of Columbus and Magellan. In their time, they were seen as barbarians, ruthless, godless, untamed. But history, in its long patience, reveals a deeper truth, that the Vikings were among the most adaptive and inventive peoples of their age. They absorbed what they found, words, customs, technologies, and made them their own. They were both destroyers and builders, conquerors and craftsmen. Perhaps that duality is what makes them endure in our imagination. We see in them a reflection of ourselves, our hunger for discovery, our defiance against limits, our longing to carve meaning from chaos. In modern Scandinavia, the old spirit still breathes. The descendants of the Sea Kings became explorers of a different kind, scientists, sailors, engineers, artists. The nations that once sent longships now send satellites, yet the principle is the same, to see what lies beyond. The same curiosity that drove Leif Erikson to the Western Sea drives humanity to the stars. There is poetry in that continuity, a reminder that exploration is not a moment in history, but a state of being. If you stand today on the coast of Norway, where fjords cut through the earth like ancient scars, you can still feel it. The wind carries voices older than kingdoms. The water, dark and deep, remembers every keel that ever passed. Somewhere beneath the waves lie the bones of ships and remains of dreams, and yet, above them, the horizon still gleams with promise. To the Vikings, that horizon was both invitation and warning. Beyond it lay glory or death. But they went anyway, always. And in that choice to go, despite the fear, despite the odds, they became something timeless. Explorers not just of geography, but of the human condition. They proved that courage is not the absence of danger, but the willingness to face it. Their story is the story of humanity itself, a restless journey through chaos toward meaning. And even now, 1,000 years after their sails vanished into mist, we still chase their ghosts in every voyage, every ambition, every dream that begins with the words, "What lies beyond?" For the Vikings taught us one truth that time cannot erase, that greatness is not given, but found on the edge of the world. The age of the Vikings had ended, but the echo of their oars never truly ceased. Across Europe, traces of their presence lingered like salt on the wind, a whisper of the old gods beneath the songs of new churches. They had changed the world, though the world did not yet realize how deeply. In the British Isles, the Norse had sown both blood and culture. Cities like York, once Jorvik, bore their imprint in stone and street. Beneath cobblestones lay layers of their world, wooden halls, runic carvings, the remains of traders and warriors who once called the place home. The language itself had absorbed them. Everyday English, words like sky, egg, knife, window, husband, carries the echo of Old Norse. 1,000 years later, we still speak their legacy without knowing it. Even the laws bore their mark. The Danelaw, once a Viking-controlled territory in England, had set patterns of governance that would ripple through history. Local assemblies or things became models of collective judgment, a reminder that even among raiders, there was a deep respect for order, for consensus, for the weight of the spoken word. In Normandy, the Vikings had become the very thing they once despised: lords, nobles, landowners. The descendants of Rollo, the Viking who had once taken the land by force, grew into the Norman dukes who would one day invade England under a new banner. When William the Conqueror crossed the Channel in 1066, it was not the return of the Vikings, but their evolution. His men spoke French, wore mail, rode horses, yet their blood remembered the sea. The conquest of England by the Normans was, in truth, the final Viking invasion in disguise. But beyond the wars and borders, something more subtle endured, a way of seeing the world. The Vikings had believed that life was a voyage. That fate was a thread spun by unseen hands, that death itself was not an end, but another shore. This worldview, fierce, fatalistic, but strangely free, seeped into the European imagination. The sagas, written centuries after the last longship sailed, captured it in haunting prose. The dignity of courage, the melancholy of impermanence, the beauty of striving against doom. To read the sagas is to glimpse the soul of a people who never stood still. They are not mere stories of gods and heroes. They are maps of a worldview, drawn in wind and water and blood. In those stories, we meet men and women who live in the shadow of vastness, farmers who defy kings, seers who speak with the dead, warriors who face the end of the world with laughter. Their gods, too, are mortal, destined to die in Ragnarok, the twilight of the world. There is a strange nobility in that. Even the divine is not eternal. The Norse saw no shame in dying, only in living without honor. That ethos shaped how they explored. For them, the unknown was not to be feared, it was to be tested. The sea was a mirror for the soul, calm one day, merciless the next. To survive, it was to earn one's place in the story of the world. Even as their ships disappeared from the horizon, their descendants carried that spirit forward. In Iceland, poets and historians became the new explorers, mapping not lands, but language. Men like Snorri Sturluson preserved the myths and histories of the North, weaving prose that would one day inspire the imaginations of writers from Tolkien to Boris. The sagas became the longships of memory, carrying the old world into the new. Through them, the Vikings sailed again, across centuries and cultures. And yet, their legacy was not only one of words. It was carved into bones, into art, into the very tools of civilization. Their shipbuilding techniques influenced generations of mariners. Their designs, clinker-built hulls, overlapping planks, set the foundation for European naval architecture. Their navigational instincts, guided by the sun and stars and seabirds, would one day echo in the voyages of Columbus and Magellan. In their time, they were seen as barbarians, ruthless, godless, untamed. But history, in its long patience, reveals a deeper truth, that the Vikings were among the most adaptive and inventive peoples of their age. They absorbed what they found, words, customs, technologies, and made them their own. They were both destroyers and builders, conquerors and craftsmen. Perhaps that duality is what makes them endure in our imagination. We see in them a reflection of ourselves, our hunger for discovery, our defiance against limits, our longing to carve meaning from chaos. In modern Scandinavia, the old spirit still breathes. The descendants of the Sea Kings became explorers of a different kind, scientists, sailors, engineers, artists. The nations that once sent longships now send satellites, yet the principle is the same, to see what lies beyond. The same curiosity that drove Leif Erikson to the Western Sea drives humanity to the stars. There is poetry in that continuity, a reminder that exploration is not a moment in history, but a state of being. If you stand today on the coast of Norway, where fjords cut through the earth like ancient scars, you can still feel it. The wind carries voices older than kingdoms. The water, dark and deep, remembers every keel that ever passed. Somewhere beneath the waves lie the bones of ships, the remains of dreams, and yet, above them, the horizon still gleams with promise. To the Vikings, that horizon was both invitation and warning. Beyond it lay glory or death. But they went anyway, always. And in that choice to go, despite the fear, despite the odds, they became something timeless. Explorers not just of geography, but of the human condition. They proved that courage is not the absence of danger, but the willingness to face it. Their story is the story of humanity itself, a restless journey through chaos toward meaning. And even now, 1,000 years after their sails vanished into mist, we still chase their ghosts in every voyage, every ambition, every dream that begins with the words, "What lies beyond?" For the Vikings taught us one truth that time cannot erase, that greatness is not given, but found on the edge of the world. Long after their sails disappeared beyond the mists of time, the Vikings endured not only in memory, but in myth. And as centuries passed, the myth grew, swelling like a wave until it towered over the truth. To later generations, they were giants of the sea, men who defied death and gods alike. But beneath the legends, beneath the endless retellings, lies something far more compelling, the human heartbeat that gave rise to it all. The Vikings did not see themselves as conquerors of nature. They were its children. Theirs was a world carved from extremes, where summer and winter waged endless war, where the sea could bless or betray without warning, where survival itself was an act of defiance. Fire and frost ruled their lives. In this fragile balance, they forged a belief system that mirrored the land's brutality and beauty. In the beginning, they said, there was nothing, only the void of Ginnungagap. From the fire realm of Muspelheim and the icy wastes of Niflheim came the first sparks of creation. The universe itself was born from contrast, from the meeting of destruction and stillness. To live, then, was to balance between chaos and order, to accept that even the gods were bound by fate. That philosophy ran deep through Norse life. To fight was not to deny fear, but to honor it. To die was not tragedy, but fulfillment. They did not seek peace. They sought purpose. When a man fell in battle, it was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of another. The sagas tell us that the slain were chosen by the Valkyries, carried to Odin's hall, to feast until the end of days. Yet in that story lies a deeper truth. Even the strongest needed to believe their struggle meant something. In their myths, we glimpse their soul. Odin, the wanderer, the seeker of wisdom, sacrifices his eye for knowledge, hangs himself from the world tree to grasp the runes. Thor, the protector, fights endlessly against chaos, knowing that one day he will fail. Loki, the trickster, brings ruin and renewal alike. Their gods are not perfect. They are flawed, wounded, driven. They mirror the people who imagine them, a reflection of humanity's own contradictions. And in their myths, the Vikings found a mirror for their existence on the edge of the world. Every storm was a reminder of Thor's hammer. Every raven that circled above the shore might be Odin's. Every twilight was the shadow of Ragnarok, the prophecy that one day all things would burn, even the gods themselves. Yet even in that final vision of destruction, there was hope. For after the fire and ruin, the sagas whisper, a green world would rise again, reborn from ash. To a people who lived at the mercy of the elements, this was not despair, it was comfort. Everything ends, yes, but everything also begins anew. That faith in renewal, in the cyclical nature of existence, shaped their endurance. It was why they dared to sail into unknown seas, why they built homes in lands of ice and shadow. Every voyage was a rebirth, a chance to begin again, to carve life from the void. And yet, the Viking myth has never stood still. Over the centuries, it has been reimagined again and again, by poets, by painters, by politicians, by storytellers. In the 19th century, Romantic Europe rediscovered the North. Artists painted Norse gods as noble savages, untamed yet pure. Writers like Richard Wagner and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow resurrected them in verse and opera, transforming raiders into symbols of primal strength and destiny. The North became a metaphor for authenticity, a place untouched by civilization's corruption. But myth is a double-edged sword. The same legends that inspired awe were also twisted for darker ends. In the early 20th century, nationalist movements in Europe claimed Norse heritage as a mark of racial purity, distorting the ancient sagas into propaganda. The Vikings, who had once embraced diversity through trade and travel, were reduced to caricatures of conquest. Their story, once vast and human, became a weapon of ideology. Yet truth endures beneath distortion. Modern scholarship, guided by archaeology and linguistics, has restored the complexity of the Norse world. We now know that Viking society included women traders, warriors, and rulers. That their ships reached not only west to America, but east to the Caspian Sea. That they were not simply destroyers, but connectors, weaving together the threads of continents through commerce and culture. Even the idea of Viking itself is a simplification. In Old Norse, Vikinger meant not an ethnicity, but a profession, one who goes raiding or trading overseas. It was an act, not an identity. You could be a farmer one season and a Viking the next. It was about motion, opportunity, choice. Perhaps that is the true myth within the man, that they refuse to be defined by one thing. Warrior and poet, pagan and Christian, raider and settler, myth and mortal. The Viking was all of these and none. In that way, they belong to every age. For every generation faces its own Ragnarok, its own test against the elements, whether of nature, of war, or of spirit. And like the Norsemen, we too seek meaning amid uncertainty. Their gods may be gone, their ships long rotted, but their philosophy remains, not in temples, but in our pulse, that life is a storm worth sailing through. That knowledge is worth any sacrifice. That courage is its own eternity. Stand beneath the northern lights and you can almost feel it, the old power humming through the air, the mingling of fire and frost, destruction and rebirth. The world they imagined still breathes within ours, unseen but undeniable. And maybe that's the truest legacy of all, that they understood what most civilizations forget. That myth is not a lie we tell about the past, but a truth we carry into the future. In the centuries after the Viking Age faded into legend, the waves they once ruled remained restless. The same winds that had filled their sails whispered their memory to those who came after, sailors, dreamers, poets. The Norse may have vanished as a people of war, but as a people of wonder, they endured. Their spirit was not extinguished by time. It was scattered like embers across the world, glowing wherever courage and curiosity took root. When the medieval world stabilized, Europe's gaze turned outward again, not to defend its shores, but to explore the horizon. And though those later mariners sailed under the banners of Spain, Portugal, England, or France, they carried something of the North within them. For the Vikings had proved, long before the age of Columbus, that the sea could be crossed, that the unknown could be known. Their roots, their courage, their willingness to trust the uncertain, all of it became a silent inheritance. You can see their echo in the age of exploration. The Portuguese caravels, the English galleons, their lines descend from the longship's sleek genius. The Vikings had discovered that a vessel could be both swift and strong, capable of gliding over shallow rivers and enduring ocean storms. That philosophy of design, adaptability, resilience, speed, became the foundation of naval innovation for centuries. Even the compass of imagination they left behind guided explorers long after their time. When Columbus dreamed of sailing west to find the east, he was chasing the shadow of Leif Erikson. When Magellan circled the globe, he was following the instinct the Vikings had first proven, that the world was not an end, but a circle. But their legacy was not merely technical. It was psychological. The Norse had lived in constant conversation with the unknown, and that dialogue reshaped how Europe saw itself. Before them, the horizon was fear. After them, it became a promise. The Viking story, though rooted in a specific age, is the story of human becoming. It reminds us that civilization itself is born not in comfort, but in motion. We grow when we move. We evolve when we dare. That restless energy, the willingness to risk, to build, to rebuild, lies at the heart of every great human endeavor. Even today, when we send machines beyond the atmosphere, when we whisper to satellites across the void, when we reach for Mars or dream of other stars, we are speaking a language first uttered by the people of the North. The same curiosity that drove them across the Atlantic drives us across the universe. The same courage that led them into storms now leads us into space. Humanity never stopped voyaging. It only changed its vessel. Yet even as their legacy expanded outward, their memory sank inward, into the soil, into the sagas, into the names etched upon maps. For in the North, memory is a kind of religion. The Icelandic sagas, once copied by candlelight, became the backbone of an identity that refused to vanish. Through centuries of foreign rule and shifting faith, the Norse voice remained quiet but unbroken. In Greenland, the last Norse colony fell silent around the 15th century. The reasons remain a puzzle: climate change, isolation, dwindling trade, perhaps the creeping ice itself. But even their disappearance became legend. Some say they sailed west again, toward the setting sun, chasing the ghost of Vinland. Others say they stayed, turning Inuit, their descendants hidden among Arctic tribes. The truth, like the sea, guards its secrets. But what they left behind is unmistakable. Place names, artifacts, words, bones. In Newfoundland, at Lonzo Meadows, archaeologists found the remains of their settlement, the first known European presence in North America. A blacksmith's forge, a spindle whorl, the faint outline of turf walls. Simple things, yet profound. Proof that they had been there, centuries before history caught up. Proof that the world had once been smaller than we imagined. And beyond the artifacts, there's something more intangible, a feeling. When you stand at the edge of that northern shore, with the Atlantic stretching endlessly west, you can almost hear it, the whisper of sails, the creak of oars, the murmur of men speaking in a tongue that's both foreign and familiar. The ghosts of explorers past, still chasing the horizon. Even now, the Vikings fascinate us not because they conquered, but because they dared. Their story resonates in an age where the frontiers we face are no longer oceans, but ideas, no longer lands to discover, but truths to confront. The spirit of exploration has shifted inward to the frontiers of science, of consciousness, of survival itself. Yet the question remains the same. What lies beyond? Perhaps that is why their legend has endured in ways few others have. The Romans built empires, the Egyptians built monuments, but the Vikings built momentum, a living current that carried the human story forward. Their influence ripples through art and language, through philosophy and imagination. When we speak of courage, of freedom, of destiny, we speak their words without knowing it. When we tell stories of heroes who defy fate, of travelers who journey into the unknown, we are retelling their saga in new forms. And when we gaze across our own seas of uncertainty, political, technological, existential, we feel what they must have felt, the pull of the horizon, the ache of fear mixed with wonder. The same pulse that once beat in the hearts of the sea kings beats still in ours. In the end, the Vikings remind us not that the world was once vast, but that it still is, that every generation must rediscover its own oceans, its own courage, its own sense of awe. For somewhere in the cold salt of our blood, beneath centuries of forgetting, their spirit endures, a whisper urging us onward. Sail. In the deep hush of a northern dawn, where the sea breathes softly against the stones. The story of the Vikings does not end. It simply fades into the mist, eternal as the tide. The world has moved on. Longhouses have turned to ruins, and the sails that once flecked the horizon with white have turned to dust. Yet in that stillness, one can almost hear them, the echo of oars cutting water, the low murmur of men preparing for a journey that has no map. The Vikings lived and died by movement. To stand still was to wither. Their faith, their art, their lives were shaped by the belief that the world was alive, that the sea itself had moods, that mountains held spirits, that wind carried the will of unseen gods. Every voyage was both physical and sacred. To sail was to speak with the divine. To fall beneath the waves was to return to it. In that way, their story transcends the bounds of time. They were more than raiders or traders. They were interpreters of the human condition, restless, yearning, unafraid of the dark. They believed that life was not meant to be safe, but meaningful, that the measure of a man was not in how long he lived, but how far he dared to go. It is said that when a great Viking died, his ship was set ablaze and pushed into the sea, a pyre upon the waves, a final voyage into eternity. The flames would rise, mirrored in the water, until both sky and sea were one burning horizon. And as the vessel sank into the dark, it was as if the man himself had joined the wind. That ritual, so haunting, so poetic, captures the essence of what they were. They did not fear endings, for they saw in every ending the seed of another beginning. To them, death was not a wall, but a threshold. Even their mythology mirrored this truth. In Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, the world ends not in despair, but in renewal. The sea swallows the land, the sky falls, the stars vanish, and yet, from the ashes, a new world rises, green and pure, beneath a sun reborn. The Vikings, in their own way, taught us that even destruction is a form of creation. That understanding gave their courage a strange serenity. They knew that everything beautiful must one day burn, and yet they sailed anyway. That is what made them great explorers, not their ships, not their axes, not even their maps, but their acceptance of impermanence. They understood that the horizon always recedes, that discovery is endless, and that to chase it is to be truly alive. Their descendants carried that spirit long after their gods had been forgotten. The Norse blood flowed into kingdoms and empires, into the veins of England, Scotland, Normandy, Iceland, and beyond. Their words became part of the languages we speak. Their symbols, part of the myths we tell. The world we live in, the world connected by trade, by exploration, by curiosity, was in many ways born from their voyages. But more than that, they left us a philosophy, a belief that the unknown is not an enemy to be feared, but a companion to be embraced. That truth, perhaps, is their most enduring gift. In a sense, we are all their heirs. Every time a human being takes a leap into the dark, invents, explores, loves, creates, we reenact the saga of the North. Every scientist staring into the mysteries of the cosmos, every diver descending into the black silence of the deep, every poet who dares to speak the unspeakable, all are Vikings in spirit, voyagers in search of meaning. For the great ocean they once sailed has changed its form. It is no longer only the North Atlantic or the icy fjords. It is the ocean of time, of knowledge, of human experience. And though the vessels are different, the voyage is the same. Perhaps that is why their memory feels so alive, because it is not confined to the past. It is a mirror in which we see ourselves. The same hunger that drove them from the fjords drives us still, to connect, to understand, to defy the limits placed upon us. We no longer raise longships, but we raise questions. We no longer wield axes, but we wield imagination. Yet if they could see us now, they would recognize the gleam in our eyes. That same fire, the refusal to bow before the vastness of the world, the quiet joy of setting out into the unknown. The Vikings knew, as we must know, that the map is never finished. There is always another shore waiting to be found. And so their saga ends where it began, with the sea, the endless whispering sea that both birthed and buried them, the sea that taught them humility and courage, that took from them everything, yet gave them eternity. As the northern lights shimmer above the dark water, one can almost see their silhouettes, distant figures rowing toward the horizon, their song carried faintly on the wind. It is not a song of conquest or victory, but of continuity, of life moving ever forward. For in the end, the Vikings did not conquer the world, they joined it. They became part of its heartbeat, part of its story. And like all great stories, theirs never truly ends. It only transforms, echoing in new voices, in new journeys, in new dreams. And so, as we stand on the shore of our own uncertain age, with the waves of technology, of change, of destiny crashing before us, we might remember them. The men and women who once faced their own storms and chose not to turn back. The ones who sailed toward the horizon, and in doing so, expanded what it meant to be human. Their saga is a reminder that greatness does not lie in what we conquer, but in what we dare to seek. That the spirit of exploration, the refusal to accept the boundaries of the known, is not a relic of the past, but the compass of our future. And somewhere, beyond the mist and memory, beneath the same cold stars that once guided their ships, the sea still whispers their eternal invitation, soft, infinite, unending. Sail.